Hi, boys and girls. It is time for social studies. We're still learning about kings and queens. Yesterday we learned about Cinderella. Today we're reading the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I'm sure you've all heard the story, but we're going to read it today. So get nice and comfy and let's get started. There was once a queen who was very beautiful, but she was very vain. She could not bear to think that anyone might be more beautiful than she. The queen had a magic mirror, and she would look into it and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror would answer, "You, queen, you are the fairest of us all." And she was satisfied, for she knew that the mirror spoke truth. The queen's stepdaughter was a darling little girl named Snow White. And as Snow White grew up, she grew prettier and prettier. And when she was 7 years old, she was more beautiful than the queen herself. So one day, when the queen went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" the mirror answered, "Though you are fair, O queen, 'tis true, Snow White is still fairer than you." When the queen heard this, she turned green with jealousy, and from that moment her heart turned against Snow White. Envy grew in her like weeds, until one day she called for a huntsman and said, "Take the child into the woods and away from my kingdom." The huntsman took the child into the forest, but he took pity on Snow White and told her to run away. So there's the huntsman, and so instead of killing her, he said, "Run away, Snow White." So as the huntsman galloped away, poor Snow White found herself alone in the woods. She felt afraid and ran as long as her feet would carry her, until at last, as evening fell, she came upon a little house deep in the woods. She went inside to rest. Inside the house, everything was very small, but as neat and clean as possible. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Nearby stood a little table covered with a white cloth and set with 7 little plates, 7 knives, and 7 forks, and 7 little drinking cups. Snow White was very hungry, but she didn't want to eat anyone's whole meal, so she took a little porridge and bread from each plate and a little sip from each cup. And after that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the little house came home. There were 7 dwarfs who worked every day in the mountains, digging with their picks and shovels for gold. When they had lighted their 7 candles, they saw that everything in the house was not the same as they had left it. They looked around and saw Snow White asleep on a bed, and they came running up with their candles and said, "Oh, goodness gracious!" She was sleeping so peacefully that they did not wake her. The next morning, Snow White woke and saw 7 dwarfs. They seemed quite friendly, so she told them how the queen had made her leave the kingdom and how she had to run the whole day long until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarf said, "Well, if you will keep house for us, you may stay with us, and we will make sure you have everything you need." So every morning the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. When the dwarfs were away during the day, Snow White was alone at the house. And the dwarfs warned her, saying, "Don't let anyone in the house. Beware of the queen. She may find out where you are." And indeed, one day the queen went to her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered, "O queen, you are of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen with 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." The queen gasped. She knew that the mirror spoke the truth and that Snow White must still be in the kingdom. She thought of a plan to get rid of Snow White. So she went to a dark and secret room, and there she made a poisonous apple. It was so big, beautiful, and red that anyone who saw it would long for it, but whoever ate even a piece would fall asleep forever. Then the queen made herself look like a peddler, and she went across the 7 mountains to the home of the 7 dwarfs. When she knocked on the door, Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs told me not to." "All right, I'll go," said the old woman. "But here, let me give you one of my apples." "No," said Snow White, "I am not supposed to take anything." "Goodness, child, you act like the apples are poisoned," said the old woman. "Look here, I'll take a bite of this apple myself." "All right." But the wicked queen had thought of everything. When she made the poisonous apple, she put poison only on one side, the side that now held out facing towards Snow White. So Snow White looked at the lovely apple and wanted it so much that when she saw the old woman take a bite of the other side, the side without the poison, Snow White could not resist. She stepped outside and took the apple and bit the poisonous part of the apple and fell down as if she would never get up again. When the queen went home, she rushed to her mirror and she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered, "You are now the fairest of us all." Well, the dwarfs came home and found Snow White laying there as if she was dead. They lifted her up and looked for some way to help her, but they found nothing, and nothing they did help the child. And they sat around her, all 7 of them, and wept. They loved her so much that for many years Snow White lay in the dwarf's home, and all the while she never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, as skin with white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony. Then one day a prince was riding through the woods. He stopped at the dwarf's house. From there he could see the beautiful Snow White. She was so beautiful he felt he had to kiss her. As the prince gently lifted Snow White, a piece of poison apple came out of Snow White's throat. Snow White sat up and cried, "Oh, what happened?" The prince, full of joy, said, "You were in a deep, deep sleep. I am the prince, and I love you more than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle and be my bride." A splendid wedding was held for the prince and Snow White. Snow White's wicked stepmother, the queen, was invited to the wedding. When she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror answered, "Though you are fair, O queen, 'tis true, the new bride is fairer than you." The queen screamed with anger. First she thought she would not go to the wedding. Then she thought she had to go and see the new bride. And when she saw the new bride, she recognized her as Snow White, and she was filled with terrible rage. In a wild fury, she screamed and stomped her feet and jumped up and down, and as though she were wearing red-hot shoes, and ran away and never came back. She never caused Snow White trouble again, and Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after. All right, boys and girls, that is the story of Snow White. And you might have noticed there's a few things different from the way that we have heard Snow White, especially if we have watched in the Disney movie. But that's okay. It makes it kind of interesting, doesn't it? So now we're going to take our worksheets from our packet, and you have a worksheet today that says first, then, next, after, also, and last. And we have pictures from the story that you can cut out. There are 6 pictures, and we are going to put them in order of how they happened in the story. Just like we've done on other paper, just today we have a paper that tells us first, then, next, after, also, and last. Are you ready?
That's called a different vocabulary.
Yes, it is.
Yep.
All right, Miss Barrett.
All right.
So we have a picture. What happened first in the story? The first picture that we're looking at, it looks like it's, can you see?
Oh, okay. It's the huntsman when he takes her to the forest.
He takes Snow White to the forest. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that should be our first picture, is the huntsman taking Snow White to the forest. And remember, he's supposed to get rid of her for the queen, but does he? No, he feels bad. And so then she goes and she runs away in the woods, finally finds the dwarf's house, lives there happily.
Yep.
And then the queen finds out she's alive. So then what does the queen do?
So then the queen dresses up as a peddler and comes into the forest with this beautiful red, delicious looking apple.
Okay, so there's the.
which is poisoned
So there's.
for Snow White.
There she is with her poisoned apple, and I've never heard the part about half of it being poisoned.
I
Have you?
haven't either. No.
So that's a little bit different
Mhm.
from what we're used to.
Yep.
So she's running from the huntsman. The queen now has the poison apple, and then what does she do with the apple? She takes it to
Snow White.
To Snow White. She goes and finds Snow White and tries to give her the apple. So that
She convinces her that it's fine by eating half of the apple, the part that's not
the
poisoned.
poison. Yep. And so that goes on our next box. There we go. And then what happens after? After she eats the apple and
Then the 7 dwarfs find Snow White and they try to take care of her and they put her on the bed and they take care of her for a few years because she's in a deep sleep.
yeah, and she's sleeping on the bed. There we go. So that is after. And then also is our next word. Also, what happens then? She's asleep, and who comes through the woods?
Ah, the prince.
The prince comes, and he sees Snow White.
He just falls madly in love with her.
He thinks she's so beautiful.
Yes, he does.
And he goes to her, and there was a piece of apple stuck in her throat. That's a new part of the story too, is but when he picks her up, it falls out, and she wakes up. And after she wakes up, and then what happens last?
The last thing is they get married and live happily ever
So
after.
you have a picture of them, a wedding picture of them. You can tell Snow White's in her wedding dress. Very good. So that is what happens last. Okay, boys and girls, have fun with your story of Snow White and get those pictures in order in sequence of how the story happened.